Section 1.5, Sources of Errors in Sampling. Objectives. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to 1. Understand how error can be introduced during sampling, and 2. Identify which errors have been made given an example. Now, so far, we have looked at how to gather samples, but not at some of the problems that inevitably arise in sampling. Remember, the goal of sampling is to collect information about a population through a sample. If the results of the sample are not representative of the population, then the sample has bias. Now, there are 3 sources of bias in sampling: sampling bias, non-response bias, and response bias. First one is sampling bias, which means that the technique used to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. Now, any convenience sample has sampling bias because the individuals are not chosen through a random sample. Sampling bias also results due to undercoverage, which occurs when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in a sample than it is in the population. Undercoverage can result if the frame used to obtain the sample is incomplete or not representative of the population. Surveyors of voters or even of CMC students require a complete list of all the individuals. If an individual isn't on a list, any sample taken won't be representative. Now, sampling bias can lead to incorrect predictions. For example, the magazine Literary Digest predicted that Alfred M. Landon would defeat Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election. The Literary Digest conducted a poll based on a list of its subscribers, telephone directories, and automobile owners. On the basis of the results, the Literary Digest predicted that Landon would win with 57% of the popular vote. However, Roosevelt won the election with about 62% of the vote. This election took place during the height of the Great Depression. So in 1936, most subscribers to the magazine, households with telephones, and automobile owners were Republican, the party of Landon. Therefore, the choice of the frame used to conduct the survey led to an incorrect prediction due to sampling bias. Essentially, there was an undercoverage of Democrats. Gaining access to complete list of individuals in a population. It is difficult to gain access to a complete list of the individuals in a population. For example, public opinion polls often use random telephone surveys, which implies that the frame is all households with telephones. This method of sampling excludes households without telephones as well as homeless people. If these people differ in some way from people with telephones or homes, the results of the same sample may not be valid. The federal government prohibits the random calling of cellular phones. However, a study done by Pew Research Center suggests that excluding cell phone-only homes from telephone surveys do not significantly affect the results. Non-response bias. Non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who do. Non-response can occur because individuals selected for the sample do not wish to respond or the interviewer was unable to contact them. All surveys will suffer from non-response. Non-response bias. The federal government's current population survey has a population rate of about 92%, but it varies depending on the age of the individual. For example, the response rate for 20 to 29-year-olds is 85%, and for individuals 70 and older, it is 99%. Response rates in random digit dialing (RDD) telephone surveys are typically around 70%. Email survey response rates hover around 40%, and mail surveys can have response rates as high as 60%. Now, non-response bias can be controlled using callbacks. So, for example, if a mail questionnaire was not returned, a callback might mean phoning the individual to conduct the survey. If an individual is not at home, a callback might mean returning to the home at other times in the day. Another method to improve non-response is using rewards such as cash payments for completing a questionnaire or incentives such as a cover letter that states that the responses to the questionnaire will determine future policy. So, using rewards or incentives. So, for example, I received $1 with a survey regarding my satisfaction with a recent purchase. The $1 payment was meant to make me feel guilty enough to fill out the questionnaire. As another example, a city may send out questionnaires to households and state in a cover letter that the responses to the questionnaire will be used to decide pending issues within the city. Literary Digest poll. The Literary Digest mailed out more than 10 million questionnaires and 2.3 million people responded. The rather low response rate contributed to the incorrect prediction. After all, Roosevelt was the incumbent president, and only those who were unhappy with his administration were likely to respond. By the way, in the same election, 35-year-old George Gallup predicted that Roosevelt would win the election in a survey involving 50,000. Response bias exists when the answers on a survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. Types of response bias. Interviewer error. A trained interviewer is essential to obtain accurate information from a survey. A skilled interviewer can elicit responses from individuals and make the interviewee feel comfortable enough to give truthful responses. For example, a good interviewer can obtain truthful answers to questions as sensitive as, "Have you ever cheated on your taxes?" Do not trust survey results if the sponsor has a vested interest in the results of the survey. Would you trust a survey conducted by a car dealer that reports 90% of customers say that they would buy another car from a dealer? Misrepresented answers. Some survey questions result in responses that misrepresent facts or flat-out lies. For example, a survey of recent college graduates may find that self-reported salaries are inflated. Also, people may overestimate their abilities. For example, ask people how many push-ups they can do in 1 minute, and then ask them to do the push-ups. How accurate are they? A classic example here is a survey I've done in my developmental classes about how often students study. Because of the nature of the variable in question, it has to be self-reported, but many students misjudge or even lie about how much they're really studying. Wording of questions. The way a question is worded can lead to response bias in a survey, so questions must always be asked in balanced form. For example, the yes-no question. Do you oppose the reduction of the state taxes should be written? Do you favor or oppose the reduction of the state taxes? The second question is balanced. Do you see the difference? Now, consider the following report based on studies from Schumann and Presser who asked the following 2 questions. A. Do you think the United States should forbid public speeches against democracy? B. Do you think the United States should allow public speeches against democracy? For those respondents presented with question A, 21.4% gave yes responses, while for those given question B, 47.8% gave no responses. The conclusion you may arrive that is that most people are not necessarily willing to forbid something, but more people are willing not to allow something. These results illustrate how wordy a question can alter a survey's outcome. Another consideration in wording a question is not to be vague. The question, "How much do you study?" is too vague. Does the researcher mean how much do I study for all my classes or just for statistics? Does the researcher mean per day or per week? The question should be written, "How many hours do you study statistics each week?" Order of questions or words. Many surveys will rearrange the order of the questions within a questionnaire so the responses are not affected by prior questions. Consider an example from Schumann and Presser in which the following 2 questions were asked. Do you think the United States should let communist newspaper reporters from other countries come in here and send back to their papers the news as they see it? B. Do you think a communist country such as Russia should let American newspaper reporters come in and send back to America the news as they see it? Now, for surveys conducted in 1980 in which the questions appeared A, then B, 54.7% of the respondents answered yes to A, and 63.7% answered yes to B. Now, if the questions were ordered B, then A, then 74.6% answered yes to A, and 81.9% answered yes to B. When Americans are first asked if U.S. reporters should be allowed to report communist news, they are more likely to agree that communists should be allowed to report American news. Questions should be arranged as much as possible to help reduce effects of this type. Now, pollsters will also rearrange words within a question. So, for example, the Gallup organization routinely asked the following question of 1,017 adults age 18 or older. Do you, in this case, rotated approve or disapprove of the job of the president? The words approve and disapprove are rotated to remove the effect that may occur by writing the word approve first in the question. Type of question. One of the first considerations in designing a question is determining whether the question should be open or closed. Now 1. Open question. An open question allows the responded to choose his or her a response. For example, what is the most important problem facing America's youth today? Closed question. A closed question requires the respondent to choose from a list of predetermined responses. For example, what is the most important problem facing America's youth today? A. Drugs. B. Violence. A. Single-parent homes. D. Promiscuity. E. Peer pressure. And 5 answers are given in this case. Now, in closed questions, the possible responses should be arranged because respondents are likely to choose early choices in a list rather than later choices. An open question should be phrased so that the responses are similar. You don't want a wide variety of responses. This allows for easy analysis of the responses. Closed questions limit the number of responded choices, and therefore the results are much easier to analyze. The limited choices, however, do not always include a respondent's desired choice. In that case, the respondent will have to choose a secondary answer or skip the question. Survey designers recommend conducting pretest surveys with open questions and then using the most popular answers as the choices on closed question surveys. Another issue to consider the closed question design is the number of possible responses. The option no opinion should be omitted because this option does not allow for meaningful analysis. The goal is to limit the number of choices in a closed question without forcing respondents to choose an option they do not prefer, which would make the survey have response bias. Data entry error. Although not technically a result of response bias, data entry error will lead to results that are not representative of the population. Once data are collected, the results typically must be entered into a computer, which could result in input errors. For example, 39 may be entered as 93. It is imperative that the data be checked for accuracy. In this text, we present some suggestions for checking for data error. Now, can a census have bias? The answer is yes. The discussion so far has focused on bias in samples, but bias can also occur when conducting a census. And how so? Well, a question on a census form could be misunderstood, thereby leading to response bias in the results. We also mentioned that it is often difficult to contact each individual in a population. So, for example, the U.S. Census Bureau faces challenges in counting each homeless person in the country. So the census data published by the U.S. government likely suffers from non-response bias. Now, lastly, in general, there are 2 types of errors that can result during sampling. Non-sampling errors result from undercoverage, non-response bias, response bias, or data entry error. Such errors could also be present in a complete census of the population. Examples of non-sampling errors might be non-responses of individuals selected to be in the survey, again, inaccurate responses, poorly worded questions, poor interview technique, and so on. Sampling error results from using a sample to estimate information about a population. This type of error occurs because a sample gives incomplete information about a population. There's really nothing that we can do about the second type. Unless we sample every single individual in the sample, there will be some error in our results. And so much later in the course, we'll talk about how we can actually get an estimate for how close we are to the true population information we're trying to get at.